Hello and welcome to the Jack Hopkins Show podcast. I'm your host, Jack Hopkins. Now, before I introduce today's guest, I want to ask you a favor. Don't worry, it's not a huge favor. One of my episodes has almost 60,000 views, but I've got just 6,300 subscribers. And what that means is a lot of people who are watching my podcast episodes aren't subscribed. Why does that matter? In short, the greater my subscriber numbers, the more likely it is that I can get and feature even more guests on my podcast, guests that you want to hear from. And that's good for you, and it's good for me as well. So if you haven't already, please like and subscribe, and I thank you in advance. Now, let's get to today's guest for today's episode. Today's guest is John Kiriakou. John is an American author, journalist, and former CIA intelligence officer. He was jailed for what the CIA called exposing the interrogation techniques of the Central Intelligence Agency. Much of the world, however, had a different view. John Kiriakou was a whistleblower on the torture program the CIA had been running, and that Gina Haspel later testified to Congress had existed. Gina Haspel was the 7th director of the CIA. Now, John was an intelligence analyst and operations officer for the CIA's Counterterrorism Center, senior investigator for the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and a consultant for ABC News. He was the first U.S. government official to confirm in December of 2007 that waterboarding was used to interrogate al-Qaeda prisoners, which he described as torture. Look, you are in for a treat. I just finished this episode, and I already can't wait to get him back on again. So, without further ado, let's dive right in to this episode with the fascinating and intriguing John Kiriakou. All right, John, listen, I've got to tell you, I've probably learned as much about world history from you as anyone else. In so many of the questions that you answer, I've always just been blown away at your grasp of world history. And instead of answering something within the context of, say, the last 5 to 10 years, you're able to go way back. And I find that most of the time when you provide that additional context, oh, okay, well, this all looks different then within this.
Right, right. Yeah, good point. Hey, may I tell you a quick story on that very issue?
Sure.
I had just returned from the Middle East. This was like 1996. And I was assigned to mentor a brand new junior analyst. Really, really smart young woman. She had just graduated from the University of Virginia. And she was covering the United Arab Emirates. And nothing ever happens in the UAE. We're close friends with the UAE. It was just someplace where she could learn, the writing style and such. Well, sure enough, Iran invaded an island off the coast of Sharjah, which is one of the 7 emirates of the United Arab Emirates. It's actually 2 islands. It's called Greater Tunb, T-U-N-B, and Lesser Tunb. So Iran had Greater Tunb, Sharjah had Lesser Tunb, and the Iranians took it. And this island is like, a mile by 2 miles. Nobody lives on it or anything. And I said to her, just offhandedly, we're just chatting, and I said, the UAE government's never going to do anything to get that island back. They're just going to concede it to the Iranians. And she said, why? Why would they do that? And I said, because the island is owned by Sharjah, and they don't give a shit about Sharjah because it's a minor emirate. And I said, look, foreign policy is run by Abu Dhabi, and business policy is run by Dubai. And in Dubai, much of what they trade is with Iran. So why upset the apple cart over a little tiny island that only has a couple of goats on it?
Right.
So the Sharjans are just going to be shit out of luck. she goes into the boss's office, and she comes back out, and she sits down and she says, "I just resigned." And I'm like, "What? Why did you do that?" And she said, "I realized that no matter how much I like the job, I'll never know as much about it as you do." I said, "That is ridiculous." I said, "I have a degree in Middle Eastern studies. You'll pick it all up. You're really smart." And she said, "No, I just realized this just isn't for me."
That's wild. And so my question then is, I'm guessing you were always kind of a history buff.
Yeah, always.
Yeah.
And a Middle East buff. When I was 15, the Iranians raided the American embassy and took our people hostage, and I was just fascinated, glued to it.
Yeah.
And you might remember that led to the creation of Nightline, right? So
Yes.
Nightline on ABC was meant to give us the daily update on the situation with the
I
hostages.
didn't know that.
Yeah. And then, when there were no updates to give, it became a nighttime news program and then lasted for decades.
Wow. How much did that benefit you as someone in the CIA? I can only imagine immensely.
Yeah, immensely is the word. But I was very fortunate, though, Jack, in that I knew when I was 15 what I wanted to do. When I was 9, I told my parents I wanted to be a spy when I grew up. And when
Oh,
I was
really?
15, I had decided that I wanted to be a spy in the Middle East when I grew up. And so I looked for universities that had specific programs in Middle Eastern studies. At the time, there were only three. There was Brigham Young, and they did it just to teach their would-be missionaries Arabic. There was Rutgers in New Jersey, and I just didn't want to go to school in Newark. And George Washington University, which was literally one block from the White House. That's where the action is.
Yeah.
And so I went to GW. I was one of only 3 students enrolled in the Middle Eastern Studies program there, but worth every single minute. And I was able to specialize. That became something that the CIA was looking for in the late 1980s, and I got lucky.
So you showed up with what you
I,
needed.
I was ready to go. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. You know, I've got to tell you something that I've multiple times when watching you on other podcasts, and I've heard you talk about this some, but anytime you go a different direction than maybe what I'm thinking, not in terms of predicting what you're going to say, but in terms of like being on the same page as me and you go a different direction, the thing I'm always aware of is that because I like you so much, my ears, I'm paying attention, and I don't go into that defensive mode. Is that something about yourself that you recognized early on that you could get people to warm up to you quickly?
No, frankly.
Really?
No. In fact, it's funny that you bring this up because I was on the job, I'm going to say like 6 weeks. So this is early February of 1990. And my boss, I was an analyst. Most analysts are strong introverts, and I'm a strong extrovert. But my boss said to me, "You would be a good operations officer." And I said, "Me? Why would I be a good operations officer?" And he said, "People like to be around you."
Yeah.
And I just thought, oh, okay, that's kind of odd, but all right. Well, the longer that I was in analysis, the more I realized that it wasn't really as great a fit for me as I thought it was going to be. Because I considered myself kind of an intellectual. I had bachelor's and master's degrees. I had multiple foreign languages. I was well traveled. I would go to all of the events around town that the think tanks were sponsoring. And he's like, "No, you're kind of a fish out of water. You should think about operations." And it wasn't until, 7.5 years had passed And I got bored with analysis that I decided to give operations a try.
Yeah. And did you find almost immediately, maybe when you compared yourself to your colleagues or other people on that side of the CIA, that, wow, I'm good at this?
Oh, you know what? One of my station chiefs, and this was in a big, active, major station, pulled me aside and he said, over the course of my 30-year career, he said, I had 5 recruitments, and I remember every single one of them. He said, you've been here 2 years, and you have 5 recruitments.
Yeah.
And I said, yeah, you know, as crazy as it sounds, I kind of have a knack for this.
Yeah.
And he said, whatever you're doing, just keep doing it.
I would assume that gives you a level of confidence going into an operation once you've kind of built that foundation of trust of your ability to do that.
Yeah, it became a joke. You know, we would have these classified staff meetings in the embassy's. It's called a bubble. What it is, it's a tempested, secure room where you can speak freely. There's a double wall. Music is pumped in between the walls, and you know you can't intercept anything there.
Kind of like a skiff.
It's like a skiff, but a mini. Yeah, that's a good way to say it. It's a mini skiff. So my immediate boss had this thing that he did. Whenever somebody made a recruitment, he would congratulate them in the staff meeting and then toss them a Snickers bar. That was your award for making a recruitment. You got a Snickers bar. And there was, you know, sometimes it takes you a month, sometimes it takes you a year to recruit somebody. And it just so happened that I recruited 3 people in 1 week. And
wow.
Not that, you know, I did all the work that 1 week.
Sure.
It took me a year and a quarter to get up to that point. And it just so happened that they all came to a head that 1 week. So he said, like to congratulate Kiriakou for recruiting, you know, MK Grasshopper. And he tosses me a Snickers bar, and everybody, you know, congratulations. Like to congratulate Kiriakou for recruiting, MK Orange. And people are like, okay. And Kiriakou gets a 3rd one for recruiting so-and-so. And one of the other guys is like, dude, stop. And I said, it was just one of those weeks.
Sure.
You're making us all look bad, and we're not going to get promoted. I was like, I'm sorry.
That's wild. You know, I've never heard you ask this question that I know of, and that's not to say I've watched. There may be some out there I haven't seen. When you are working in the Middle East, how relevant is your personal skin tone?
That's a good question. And no, I haven't been asked that. I found, especially when I was younger and I didn't have this gray hair and it was much thicker than it is, I fit in almost everywhere I went. And my Arabic was so good at the time, people would ask me, are you Lebanese? Because you kind of speak with a Yemeni accent, but you're too tall to be Yemeni. So the ability to fit in helped me immensely. And I'll tell you one thing, it was so funny. I was invited to a Rotary Club meeting in Abu Dhabi. And the ambassador was there, the deputy chief of mission, and the political officer, all legit State Department people. So they're all sitting at the same table, and I decide to sit with the Arabs, right? I don't want to sit with the guys that I work with all day long.
Sure.
So I'm sitting with the Arabs. And one of these Arabs says to me, look at this table over here. And he points at the ambassador, the deputy ambassador, and the political officer. He says, CIA. And I said, yeah? How can you tell? He said, the CIA guys always sit together. And I said, Mohammed, that's exactly why I'm sitting with you. Well,
Interesting.
by the end of the year, I had recruited Mohammed. And he's like, holy shit, I would never have guessed it.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you know what's always fascinating to me about those types of things, we always think of the CIA, most people, I would assume, is based on a lot of Hollywood, right?
Right.
And
it's not.
right. And I've got some questions for you about that. That's one little thing that you would think, those guys made that mistake? You know what
I
I mean?
know,
It's not
right?
right, right. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
fascinating. But was that something that prior to him saying that you'd kind of noticed too? That I guess you had because you said who wants to sit with the people you work with all day?
Yeah.
Yeah, and
Yeah. But
I'm
my station chiefs, from my very first station chief, he said, well, he said something that I later added to when I was training, young officers. He said that when you go to an event, you must come back with a fistful of business cards. Otherwise, why go to the event? To
right,
have free, hors d'oeuvres?
right,
Seriously?
sure,
And later on in my career, there was an officer that I worked with. We were in the same branch, and she was just not cut out for this job. She was really smart. She had gotten a bachelor's degree at the University of Michigan and a master's degree from Yale. But smarts doesn't always translate into being a good CIA officer, right? You have to be manipulative. You have to be able to think quickly on the fly.
sure.
So she was doing her operational meetings, and then she would go back, and they would ask her, "So what did you learn?" She's like, "He didn't really have anything to say." Well, then you've got to terminate the contract, right? Tell him, "Look, this isn't working out. Thanks for your time. Here's $1,000, going away present." So I said to her one time, my own personal rule is, if you go to an operational meeting and you come back and you don't have at least 2 intelligence reports to write, you have failed. The agent didn't fail. It's not his fault that you didn't ask the right questions. You have failed. And then the station chief called me into her office and she said, "I know what your workload is, but can you go with this officer to her next operational meeting? And you do the meeting and you teach her how to elicit the information because she's failing." And I said, "Sure." So we went to the meeting and had a nice conversation about 2 hours. And, we order some room service and there's coffee and we're laughing and talking. And it's more of just a friendly conversation than it is anything else. And then at the end of the 2 hours, the guy got up and we shook hands and he walked out. And she goes, "You see what I mean? He just doesn't say anything important." And I said, "I got 4 intelligence reports out of that conversation." And she
Wow.
said, "How?" And I said, "Let's go over it." So I said, "He said this, and then he said B, and then he said C, and then he said D. He's talking about proliferation. He's talking about a shipment of chemicals that's going to, the port of Rotterdam. He's talking." She goes, "What do I know about chemicals?" I said, "He told us what the chemical was. I don't know about chemicals either. But maybe it's a cocaine precursor. Maybe it's a chemical weapons precursor. What do I know?"
Right.
You put it in an intelligence report and you let the analysts figure it out. She's like, "I never thought of it that way." So
And is
I,
that
I
more of
wrote
an
out the
intuition?
4 reports. Yeah. Yeah.
And
And
that's
then she was okay.
and is that something in your experience, for the most part, you've either got it
Or you
or
don't.
you don't?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And one of the things that I learned relatively early on in my career was when people come into the CIA already having PhDs, they almost always fail.
Interesting.
Because, for example, you're a PhD, you've just finished writing a 300-page dissertation, and you are the world's leading expert on this issue that's so narrow that literally nobody else in the world gives a shit about it. but you think you're so smart because you have a PhD. Okay. Well, the president doesn't give a shit about your opinion on such and such an issue. The president wants the entire thing boiled down to half a page with 3 bullet points. So if you can't adapt to the CIA's writing style and tell the president only what he absolutely needs to know in order to form the most cogent policy, then you're failing. And you probably should go into journalism or academia, not intelligence.
Yeah, interesting. I knew a guy when I was a kid back in the 70s, and I had the privilege of growing up around there were a bunch of World War II vets still
Wow.
around,
Oh, that's very cool.
Yeah, really. And interestingly enough, there was part of me that had an awareness, even at that age, of how significant this opportunity was. And there was a guy, I don't think he went to school beyond 8th grade, right? A World War II vet. And he could take a fairly complex subject and condense it down into 2 or 3 sentences that would give you enough of the foundation of it that you understood it enough to want to pursue more knowledge. Mm-hmm. Not everyone can do that.
You're absolutely right.
I had much smarter people educationally and IQ wise talk to me about the same thing.
I remember during my analytic stint in that first 7.5 years, something happened in Kuwait, and I had to write something that used to be called a snowflake. So the president's daily brief starts off with the most important breaking news of the day, and that's a page. And then pages 2, 3, and 4 are, each page has 2 issues, and each issue gets 2 paragraphs, fact and analysis. Okay? So here's the breaking news on page 1. Pages 2, 3, and 4, that's 6 more short stories. And then, at the very back of the book is sort of the long-term, big picture things. You're allowed to go 2 pages on those. But then at the very, very end is something called a page of snowflakes. They no longer do this. George H.W. Bush absolutely loved the snowflakes because they were directly to the point of a story that wasn't important enough to put at the front of the briefing. So there were hard and fast rules about snowflakes. They had to be 3 separate thoughts, interrupted by ellipses, ... and they could not be more than 36 words. So you'd say, Queen of England died today, ... Prince Charles expected to take the throne by noon tomorrow, ... There will be no change in British foreign policy toward the United States. That's a snowflake.
Okay.
So one of the leaders that I was covering in the Middle East had what is colloquially known as a nervous breakdown. Okay. There is no such medical condition as a nervous breakdown. It's just a word that we all use.
Right.
So, or a term. So I went to him and I said, hey, I wrote a flake for the president because, he knows this leader very well. They're on the phone all the time. And here it is. It was like 30 words. King so-and-so had a nervous breakdown. And I put parentheses, quotation marks around nervous breakdown because I knew he would object to the term because it's not a medical term. And he's like, yeah, I don't, you have to coordinate with all the other analysts who cover the same issues so that there's agreement where, the entire intelligence community agrees that this is the situation. So he's like, yeah, I can't agree with this. I'm going to have to make a couple of changes. I said, yeah, make whatever changes you want. You're the psychiatrist. He was a psychiatrist with both an MD and a PhD in psychology. So, he sends it back to me and it has 56 words. And I said, Larry, we can't send this to the president. It has 56 words. He said, yeah, but I need 56 words to explain the situation. And I said, we can't send it. They will not send it to the president. I mean, you and I can write 5,000 words. They're not going to send it to the president. 36 words. And so it actually had to go up through the chain of command, and they just went back to my original thing with the quotation marks around it.
Fascinating. It's interesting, and I'm thinking it's probably not at all for the same reasons, but when I write my newsletters, and it's nothing I was ever taught, obviously no English teacher would ever teach you this. I rarely use commas. Where I would have a comma, I put ... Because in my mind, and I've had some feedback from subscribers, a comma doesn't necessarily translate into doing what it's supposed to do, which is kind of create that
separation.
Right?
Yeah.
But ... forces you to do it, because the distance your eyes have to track a distance before they pick up again. So it almost forces the reader into a pause. So, that's just fascinating that's how you had to write those snowflakes.
Well, getting back to the issue of the PhDs, they just could not adapt to that kind of writing style.
Yeah.
They could not adapt to not putting in their own thoughts about, whatever happened to be happening around the world. It's like nobody at the White House gives a shit about your thoughts.
Right.
Just lay out the facts. You can put your thoughts at the very end. And of all the PhDs I met who came into the CIA with the PhD, only one actually made it as a career. The other ones just ended up walking out.
I'm sure there's a good chance you would agree that you met more operatives without the educational background who were better psychologists than some of the PhDs.
Oh my God. It's funny, when you're going into operations, you have to take an enormous battery of psychological exams, because they want to make sure that you have the right personality to do something like this. And they want to make sure that you are able to operate sometimes under extreme pressure. Because not just while you're doing the job, but you're doing the job while somebody else is trying to shoot you. And it's no wonder everybody has PTSD. But I was very I was very taken when I got my psychological exams back. I tested right smack in the center of this bell curve in terms of personality type, but I tested much smarter than the average operations officer. And I kind of made a joke about it with the hiring officer. And he said, you make a joke, but seriously, these tests tell me you're going to be successful because you already know the issues. We just needed to make sure that your personality could handle the pressure. And I could.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And assuming you were a good student in high school all through.
Yeah, I was.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. To pretty much come natural to you in terms of you didn't run into things that you're like, oh my God, I can't do this.
I'll tell you what, trig and chemistry.
Yeah.
Tripped me up. But I didn't really care about trigonometry and chemistry.
Sure.
I wanted to be a spy.
Sure.
And my intent was to be a spy. And so that's really all I focused on or cared about.
Yeah. Shift gears here for a minute. It's perhaps one of the things you are most known for, but I don't think I've ever heard anybody ask you this specific question. Was there a key moment where you knew you were going to become a whistleblower? Was there was there?
Yeah. And I wish I could tell you it's because, on principle, I stood up and I decided. It was nothing like that. Brian Ross called me from ABC News in early December 2007, and he said that he had a source who said that I had tortured Abu Zubaydah. I said that was absolutely untrue. I was the only person who was kind to Abu Zubaydah. I said, I've never laid a hand on Abu Zubaydah or on any prisoner, ever. And he said, well, you're welcome to come on the show and defend yourself. I said, yeah, I'll think about it. But then that week, two things happened. President Bush this is George W. Bush, gave a press conference in which he looked right in the camera and he said, we do not torture, like that. And I happened to be sitting with my wife, who was also a senior CIA officer, and I said, he is a bald-faced liar. He is looking the American people in the eye and he's just lying to us. And then, that Friday, he was walking from the south portico of the White House to the helicopter to fly to Camp David, and a reporter shouted a question about torture, and he stopped, and he turned, and he said, well, if there is torture, it's because of a rogue CIA officer. And I said to my wife, Brian Ross's source is at the White House, and they're going to try to pin this torture program on me. I was opposed to it from 2007. From 2002. This was 2007. But I had kept my mouth shut thinking somebody is going to come out and say something.
Right.
But nobody did. And it was that moment when Bush stopped and said, rogue CIA officer, that I decided I'm going public. And I decided in the days between my call to Brian Ross and the day of the interview that no matter what he asked me, I was going to tell the truth.
And it goes without saying, you were fully aware of potential consequences, I assume.
You know, I actually wasn't. And in my own defense, I'll tell you why I wasn't. It is a felony in the United States. It's actually in the U.S. Code. It is a felony to classify a criminal act. Right? You can't classify a program if the program is a violation of U.S. law. Well, torture was clearly illegal. We have laws going back to 1946 saying that exactly those methods that we were using were outlawed.
Right.
And I thought, going public is not revealing classified information because it's illegal to classify a torture program. The FBI investigated me for a full year, from December of 2007 to December of 2008, and then wrote a letter to my attorney saying that they were declining to prosecute me because it was illegal to classify a crime. But then a month later, when Barack Obama became president, John Brennan convinced Eric Holder to secretly reopen the case against me, and then they had me.
Wow.
It was ugly.
Did you have any colleagues who were surprise supporters and backers when this all went down? Were there any people who you would have never guessed in a million years that they'll put their reputation on the line to back me?
Yeah, there was one in particular. He was a retired deputy director of the CIA. I had worked for him at the very start of my career. And I'll tell you, he was a mean SOB. But he and I went to the Middle East once together. I went as his, hat holder. He was, I'm not exaggerating when I tell you, he was 8 grades above me. That's how senior he was. So I went as his hat holder and his note taker. And we went to a country that I had covered very closely. And he was impressed with the depth of knowledge that I had in this country and its politics. So he liked me. Even though he was a mean son of a gun, he liked me. I mean, we could hear him in his office, like screaming, swearing at people. I heard him fire a guy one time, just screaming like a crazy person. And then he announced he was going to take 2 months off as a sabbatical. Well, you can't do that. But this is what they were telling everybody, 2 months off as a sabbatical. And then I heard through the grapevine that he was actually taking 2 months off to donate a kidney to his sister. His sister was dying.
Wow.
So I emailed him from my private account to his private account. I said, what a wonderful thing. Heal quickly. You're a role model. God bless you for what you're doing for your sister. Well, that just aced it for the rest of my career. Yeah. So when I blew the whistle, he emailed me. He had just retired, and he emailed me the next day. And he said, "You have chosen a difficult path, but I'm glad somebody did. I only wish I had had the guts to do it myself." And I saved that email as
yeah.
a kind of souvenir that
Yeah.
I wasn't crazy. I wasn't a traitor. I had done the right thing.
Yeah. Yeah. And I guess it goes without saying that you had people who you might have thought would be supportive who ran the other way.
Oh, listen, I had relatives who ran away from me. Yeah, relatives. You really get to understand who your friends are, truly,
Yeah.
who they truly are when something like this happens.
How have you stayed, not just then, but even now, how have you stayed connected to your own North Star, so to speak, with this duality existing?
I'm going to answer that question by telling you an anecdote that I give at colleges and universities when I speak there. I always use this example because I've always thought it was so powerful. So I say, let's say you are a CIA operations officer and you have recruited a bona fide terrorist, Al Qaeda, Hezbollah, ISIS, bad guy.
Yeah.
And you meet with him once a month at a hotel in the Middle East. And this guy has given you actionable intelligence that you have used to save the lives of Americans. So you fly out to meet with him. And at the start of the meeting, he says to you, "You know what? I've given you everything that you've wanted. And today, you're going to do something for me. You're going to go out and you're going to get me a prostitute, or I'm not talking to you ever again." So I ask, give me a show of hands. How many of you will get him the prostitute? And usually about 80% put their hands up. And I say, yeah, you would give him the prostitute. It's unseemly, it's dirty, it's gross, but this is the job that we've chosen. So you're going to go out, you get him the prostitute. What if he asks you for a child prostitute? What do you do? And people will kind of look around discreetly, and then like 10% will gingerly put their hand up. And I say, absolutely not. Not under any circumstances. But see, here's the rub. There's no rule. Remember, your job overseas is to break the law.
Right.
Your job is to get somebody to commit treason or espionage for you. Headquarters isn't going to care if you go out looking for a child prostitute. But listen,
Right.
some things really are black and white, right or wrong. And getting a man a child prostitute is just wrong. So you have to go into this job with your own moral compass. You have to go in with your own set of personal ethics because they're not going to teach it to you. There are no ethics classes at the CIA.
Yeah. And to rephrase a little bit what you said about this, your job is to break the law. Part of that could be construed by some people in the CIA as my job is to be as unethical and immoral as is required to.
And you will bump up against lots of officers who've taken that position. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. So without your own solid set of values and your own North Star, so to use that, you can go off the path really quick, I'm assuming.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, most definitely. You
Yeah.
really can. And, you know, over the years, too, you read in the papers about, oh, so-and-so, a CIA officer was arrested and charged with rape or charged with embezzlement or charged with this or charged with that because they really believe that they're the good guys under any circumstances and they can get away with anything they want to get away with. They don't have that moral compass. They're just in it for themselves. They're in it for their own gratification, whether it's sex or money or fancy watches or, you know, whatever. And they get caught.
Which leads to a question this is a question I've really been wanting to ask. Is there a gray area between sociopathy and a good CIA
Oh, most definitely.
operative?
Most definitely. I've said this many times in podcasts, but I think it bears repeating. The CIA actively seeks to hire people who have sociopathic tendencies, not sociopaths, because sociopaths have no conscience and they're impossible to control and they just blow right through the polygraph exam. You don't want people who have no conscience. Somebody with a sociopathic tendency does have a conscience, does react in the polygraph, but because we're supposed to be the good guys, is willing to work in legal, moral, and ethical gray areas.
Right. Interesting. I will relate a personal story. When I first showed up at the Naval Special Warfare Center for BUDS, and I was not a SEAL. I had a spinal injury and was med dropped early on.
My.
So I make that clear. I was not a SEAL. But I showed up at BUDS and we're running in formation one day. And one of my class leaders went on to work, I think, on a joint terrorism task force for the Obama administration. Jeffrey Eggers was his name. And so you've got a couple of guys who usually are academy guys who are your, the class officers. Mm-hmm. And we're running in formation one day, and I don't know who initiated the cadence, but the cadence was, throw the candy in the courtyard, watch the children gather round, lock and load your MP5, blow those little down. Now, let me tell you what went on in my head at that point. I've always been pretty self-aware. And I realized this group, we're not like other people, most other people. Not that I thought, oh yeah, shooting kids, that's cool. It wasn't that, but it was that I sang the cadence, and that none of us looked at each other like that was strange. And I thought, I came into this knowing what the job is, and so have both consciously and unconsciously accepted that role, that duty. And so I as I went on through life and pursued the psychology path, I was very aware that I was not a sociopath.
Of course.
But I'm very clear that I do have sociopathic tendencies, or I would have probably never have wanted to go there in the first place.
Yeah.
How many people show up there knowing that about themselves?
Almost none.
Really?
I think that they don't even really consider it. In fact, I tell this one story, but I only realized its import in retrospect. So when I was being interviewed for the job, this is 1989. I'm being interviewed for the job, and there are like 4 other men and 1 woman, and we're given this scenario. Let's say that you're serving overseas, and you get a cable from headquarters, and they want some figures on the Indonesian economy. Okay, so go out and collect it. So you start targeting the Indonesian second secretary for economic affairs at the embassy. And you take him to lunch, you hit it off, you take him to dinner, you have a great time, you introduce your wives get along, you start going to day trips together, maybe you go for a weekend together. But after all this development, you come to the conclusion that he's just not recruitable. But headquarters needs that document. So what do? So one guy raises his hand and he says, well, headquarters wants the document, so you have to double down. And you have to just keep doing what you're doing until finally he's willing to turn over the document. And then this woman raises her hand and she says, well, maybe you can get the wives more engaged and maybe you can get the document through the wife. And I'm looking around as they're answering their answers, and I'm like, I put my hand up and I said, you break into the embassy and you steal it. And he says, that's exactly what you do. You break into the embassy and you steal it. Well, that's a sociopathic tendency. A normal person wouldn't advocate breaking into a foreign government's embassy and stealing documents. But we're the good guys, and this is for the greater good, and, USA, USA. But that's what a sociopathic tendency is. I didn't know that was a sociopathic tendency.
Yeah.
It just seemed like a logical answer to me.
Would you agree that without good people who have sociopathic tendencies, we'd be in trouble?
Yes, because then all you're left with is a criminal organization.
Right.
That's a mob family you're describing, not an intelligence service.
Sure. Change topic here again. I know you've got a timeline today. What are, to the extent that you can, and I realize there are some things you just can't talk about, but to the extent that you can, what are, this is a two-part question. First, what is a surveillance method that, for its simplicity, was surprisingly effective?
That's a great question. I was always partial to foot surveillance. When you're working in a big city, a capital city, usually traffic is terrible. Anywhere in the world, traffic is terrible. So it's better to do it on foot unless you're willing to drive way out into the boondocks to do your meeting. So one thing that was easy and very effective was a technique that the CIA calls stair stepping. So if you're looking at a map, and a stair step is you go straight one block, make a right, go one block, then make a left one block, then a right one block, left one block, right one block. And so it looks like a staircase, right? But every time you go to cross the street, you look both ways to cross the street, but you're really looking for surveillance.
Gotcha.
And so they don't know where you're going, and you're making all these turns, but you're acting very normally, and you're just looking to cross the street, and then you cross the street, and then you make a left, and then you make a right, and then you make a left and make a right. Spotting surveillance couldn't be any easier than that.
That's fascinating. And again, so simple.
Yeah, very simple. Doesn't cost you anything.
Part two of that, then, is what's something that you were taught or picked up regarding surveillance that was surprisingly ineffective in real time?
That was surprisingly ineffective. Yeah. Dead drops.
Really?
Yeah. I was bad at dead drops for a while. It was the only thing in training that I struggled with. It sounds easy. You just, you put the message, underneath the footbridge, or you put it under a rock or whatever. I had a colleague who put one inside a condom, because who's going to touch a condom,
Sure.
But they're far more complicated than just that. So what you do for a dead drop is, first of all, you have to identify a place that's suitable for a dead drop. But if you're in a sophisticated country, like the United States or Russia or China or Cuba or Israel, or even, France or, places like that have really sophisticated intelligence services, just being able to identify a place for a viable dead drop is very, very difficult, number one. Number two, let's say you have a place for a viable dead drop. You've got to do several things. First, you do a 2 or 3 hour, or in the case of Russia or China, an 8-hour surveillance detection route to make sure you're not being followed. You go to the dead drop, you make the drop, then you do a surveillance detection route either back to your house or to your office. So you do 2, 3, 5, 8 hours to the drop and 2 hours back. That's a full day. That's a full work day.
Yeah.
Just to, drop a document or something.
Wow.
Number two, Then you have to do a surveillance detection route to a predetermined site to make a chalk mark so that you tip the agent to know that there's something waiting for him at the dead drop. So just to leave a single document or a piece of microfilm or, a microphone or a photograph or whatever it is you're dropping at the drop site, you're talking about a 16-hour workday.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's not practical.
Yeah. What's
It's just
interesting about that is that a simple piece of chalk being part
Yeah.
of a fairly...
Well, I'll tell you what, in training, this really got me. This is the only time I was criticized in training. Okay, so we're training in Northern Virginia, and I have a dead drop site that's a little bit farther out in the boondocks. I found a rock. I had a fake rock that you can put a key in. People put them in front of their houses.
Sure.
And it was the same color, the same shape as real rocks in the parking lot of an office building way out in the Virginia suburbs. So perfect. So, I'll put the message in there, just throw it in with the other rocks and tell the agent, this is where it is. So then I do the surveillance detection route to lay down the rock. I'm not being followed. And then I go to start my surveillance detection route to the place where I'm going to leave the chalk mark. So I had chosen an underground parking garage in Tyson's Corner, Virginia. Well, in the week or so, what I was supposed to do was just take a chalk and just make a mark on the door leading from one level to the stairwell, right?
Right.
In the week between when I picked the site and when I actually went there to make the mark, they had painted the doors. Okay, no big deal.
Yeah.
The door was yellow when I went, now it's blue. Okay, I don't care. But they used glossy paint.
Oh,
And the
boy.
chalk couldn't make a mark. And I was just going like this, and the chalk is just falling apart, and it's just not adhering to the door. And so the agent never knew that I left the drop. And they were like, listen, you fail. Not only did you fail, but surveillance saw you going like this on the door like a crazy person. You would probably, had this been in a hostile environment, you probably would have been arrested and expelled. So that was such a valuable lesson for me. I still remember it today. And I'm talking, this was 30 years ago.
Yeah.
And I still think
those are
about
the things, I guess, there are probably multiple things you encountered in your career that they can't possibly cover in your training because there was just so many variables that could happen. And that's where they rely on you to figure it out.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. I know you've got to go soon, so I've got one last question for you.
Sure.
To the best of your knowledge and based on your experience, what do you think the current state of our intelligence agencies is in relationship to our adversaries? And are we at any increased danger, or are things maybe even better and we just don't know it? Where are we?
Well, keeping in mind that I left 20 years ago, I think there are areas where we're better than everybody else, and I think there are other areas where we're lagging. On technology, we're cutting edge. And we know that thanks to the Vault 7 revelations. I mean, there is stuff that just blew my mind in the Vault 7 revelations. I had no idea the CIA was involved in, and they're quite advanced. Working with NSA and DARPA and GCHQ and the Canadians, the Australians, the New Zealanders, they've developed technologies that we can't even fathom. Where they're weak is in their understanding of foreign cultures and foreign languages, especially Chinese. I would be absolutely shocked if the CIA had more than a half a dozen case officers who spoke passable Chinese.
Really?
Mm-hmm. Just like on September 11th, 2001, there were only like 16 of us in the entire CIA who spoke Arabic. I mean, that's inexcusable.
And how does that happen, John? How it can't? I can't think that it's due to a lack of foresight. Is there something? The awareness is there, but it just doesn't happen, or
Yeah, yes, the awareness is there and it doesn't happen. Think of it this way. You are a CIA manager and you've got these guys doing operations working for you, and you're told, hey, listen, this hotshot case officer who's doing all these recruitments and getting awards, you're going to have to put him in language school for 12 months. And then he's going to go overseas and you're not going to see him for 3 more years. Well, what manager wants to give up his good people so they could go sit in a classroom for 12 months? And so they say, we're going to make an exception. You're going to go overseas without the language. Well, that might maybe work for you. It probably won't, but it could. But then the agency loses because it doesn't have enough people speaking these languages. Right after September 11th, they made a real effort to bring in new people who spoke, and I still remember the languages. They didn't want to train people. They wanted you to come into the agency with Arabic, Farsi, Dari, Pashto, Urdu, Sindhi, Punjabi, Uzbek, Tajik, Korean, Chinese, and Russian. If you could speak any of those languages, you went to the very front of the line. But, here we are still with a shortage of hard language speakers. And what do you do?
and I'm guessing Chinese is maybe one of the tougher ones to learn.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Absolutely. They don't
yeah,
want people who learned Spanish, French, and German in high school. That doesn't help anybody. And if you want to focus on, counter narcotics or something, then go work for the DEA with your Spanish. Nobody
right,
cares.
right,
They want those tough languages.
yeah. Finally, have the kind of changes that you had hoped would be implemented as a result of your coming forward as a whistleblower, have they happened on a level that you had hoped they would?
Yes and no. Yes, in that there is no torture program anymore. I'm proud to say that I had an integral role in that. I'm proud of it. John
Yes,
McCain said so on the floor of the Senate. And when Gina Haspel appeared before the Senate Intelligence Committee in her nomination hearing, she admitted finally that the torture program was a mistake. So, yes, in that respect.
right.
On the other hand, as recently as 3 weeks ago, a batch of new hires was given a slideshow with my picture on one of the slides, and it said underneath, "The Insider Threat." So CIA computers now are using AI to predict if and when an employee might be thinking about becoming a whistleblower, so they
Wow.
can nip that in the bud. And there is a reward system for CIA employees to rat out their coworkers if they think a coworker might be thinking about blowing the whistle on waste, fraud, abuse, or illegality.
And
So
to
one step forward and two back.
yeah, the implication there, just your picture and inside threat. To
Yeah.
me, if I were a new trainee there, I would take that partially as a reinforcement of this is you don't do this ever,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
that's
We didn't
a
do it.
conflicting message, I would think.
That's right.
Yeah.
That is
All right,
exactly
John.
right.
Listen, I maybe someday you will be willing to come back and we'll do this again because I've got so many things I would like to talk to you about and
My
ask you about.
pleasure. My
That would
pleasure.
be fantastic. Listen, thank you so much. I know you've got to go.
Thanks for the
Um,
invitation.
we'll do this again sometime.
Looking forward to it.
Thank you, sir.
Take care.